Harvard's Jefferson Lecture Hall wasn't meant for middle schoolers. Not in the way it was built, with its high arching ceilings, centuries-old chandeliers, and the soft hush of prestige soaked into its wooden walls. The kind of hush that told you, only the smartest belong here. The kind of hush that made Jalen Carter's heartbeat sound like a drum in his chest. 200 university students sat in tiered seats, laptops glowing, fingers twitching over keys, eyes fixed on the whiteboard at the front of the room. Equations stretched across it like tangled vines, symbols looping into symbols, formulas spiraling into abstraction. Professor Leonard Strauss, a man with thinning gray hair and a blazer more expensive than Jalen's entire wardrobe, stood with a marker poised midair, ready to finish what he called the demonstration of futility. This equation, he said, tapping the board with the marker cap, has stumped the greatest minds of this generation. A perfect storm of theoretical physics and pure math, unsolvable by all accounts. Not in our lifetime. That word. Unsolvable. Jalen didn't mean to raise his hand. Not at first. But something in the way Strauss said it, so sure, so final, ignited a small, stubborn fire inside him. Before he knew it, his hand was up, arm fully extended. His fingers twitched nervously at the knuckle, but he didn't drop them. He couldn't. The room went still. It wasn't the stillness of respect. It was the kind that came before laughter. The kind that crackled with disbelief. A low murmur rippled through the students. Someone snorted. A chair creaked. Strauss slowly turned toward him. "You have a question?" the professor asked, his voice even, but his eyes already telling a different story. Jalen felt the warmth crawl up his neck. He swallowed. "I think I might have an idea." There was silence. Thick, uncomfortable. A senior girl near the front raised her eyebrows. A guy wearing a Yale sweatshirt leaned back and whispered something under his breath. Jalen didn't hear what was said, but he didn't need to. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. What was a 12-year-old kid from South Side Chicago doing here, in this room, raising his hand? Professor Strauss blinked. "Your name?" "Jalen Carter," he replied, louder than he meant to. Strauss scanned the lecture roster on his podium, but Jalen's name wasn't there. He wasn't enrolled, not really. He was part of the Future Thinkers Summer Initiative, an experiment, as some had called it. A way for Harvard to check a diversity box, to be applauded for its outreach. No one expected him to solve anything. No one expected him to speak. "And what exactly is your idea, Mr. Carter?" Jalen hesitated, then stood. "I think, maybe we're looking at the boundary behavior the wrong way. If you reflect the singularity across a fifth axis, the instability might resolve." Now there was laughter. Not loud. Just small, biting chuckles. A few students shook their heads. One muttered, "Fifth axis. Is this a cartoon?" Jalen didn't flinch. He held Strauss's gaze. The professor didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at Jalen with something colder than condescension, curiosity. "You believe," he said slowly, "that a 12-year-old has discovered a new dimensional reflection that evades mathematical instability, on a problem PhDs have deemed impossible?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, sir." Strauss studied him for a moment longer. Then, with a sigh, he stepped aside and held out the marker. "Then by all means. Show us." Jalen walked to the front, and the sound of his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor felt like thunder in the silence. He took the marker with a shaking hand, heart hammering behind his ribs. He could smell the chalk dust, the ink, even the faint scent of wood polish off the podium. His fingers brushed against the whiteboard. He didn't need to solve the whole thing. He just needed to show them where everyone else had stopped looking. He drew a new plane intersecting the system's collapse point and started sketching a mirrored flow. A reflection not in space as they knew it, but as it might be if another dimension rotated inward instead of folding out. People weren't laughing anymore. Behind him, Strauss walked closer. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff. He just stared. Jalen kept drawing. If the anomaly isn't the function, he said, voice steadier now, but the frame in which we're modeling the function, then maybe the function's consistent. Just not to us. Not yet. Someone in the third row slowly lowered their phone, realizing they'd been recording. When Jalen stepped back, the board was different. The same symbols, but they breathed differently. It wasn't a solution. Not yet. But it was something. A beginning. Strauss said nothing for a long moment. Then he took the marker back, examined the board again, and nodded once. We'll revisit this, he said quietly. Next lecture. Jalen nodded and returned to his seat, the room watching him the entire way. No applause. No cheers. Just eyes. Wide eyes. Curious eyes. An attention that hadn't been there before. Later that night, in the quiet of his shared dorm room, Jalen sat by the window with his spiral notebook open, sketching ideas by moonlight. His bunkmate had gone to a pizza night. Jalen didn't care. He wasn't hungry. He was alive in a way he'd never been before. His phone buzzed. A notification. Someone had posted a video from the lecture. Already, it had thousands of views. The caption read, "This 12-year-old just challenged a Harvard professor on a hopeless math problem." And maybe, he's right. Jalen put the phone down. He didn't care about going viral. He cared about what his mom would say. What his little sister might think when she saw the video. He thought about the people back home who'd never get this chance, never step foot in Harvard. And he thought about the students who'd laugh today, people who would never see him coming until it was too late. Before bed, he pulled a sticky note from his bag and stuck it above his desk. Impossible is just a word. Not a fact. Then he turned out the light and smiled in the dark. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jalen Carter sat at the edge of his dorm room bed, legs stretched out in front of him. The soft hum of the university dorms outside, the distant voices, the clinking of keys, seemed like another world compared to the neighborhood he came from. He didn't belong here, not really. Not in the way these students belonged. And yet, as he ran his fingers over the pages of his spiral notebook, he felt that burning sensation of possibility, the kind he hadn't felt back in Chicago, but the kind that was quickly becoming familiar in this place. As he flipped through the notebook, filled with scribbles, equations, and half-drawn graphs, Jalen's mind kept drifting back to the moment in the lecture hall. The room had been silent, the air thick with skepticism when he raised his hand, but when he left, things had changed. The stares, the whispers, the sudden attention, it felt like a storm, but not the kind that swept everything away. This storm was different. This one had the power to build something. He had always dreamed of moments like these, even when he was a kid. Not the lecture halls or the professors, those were things he didn't even dare to imagine, but the idea that his thoughts could matter. That his ideas could make an impact. That he could rise above the noise of his upbringing. It was easy to dream about leaving the south side of Chicago, but for him, getting out meant more than just physical distance. It meant proving everyone wrong. It meant showing the world that a kid from a place like that could make a difference. That he could make a difference. Growing up in the South Side wasn't easy, even for someone as determined as Jalen. It was a place where dreams often faded before they had a chance to grow. It was a place where hope was hard to come by, and opportunities seemed like they existed only for the lucky few. But for Jalen, school had always been a refuge, a place where he could escape the chaos and imagine a world beyond the crumbling buildings and street corners that made up his reality. He wasn't like the other kids who sometimes skipped school, who hung out in the streets, looking for something to do. Jalen was different. His mind worked differently. He thought back to his mom, the one person who had always believed in him, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. She had pushed him to excel, to always reach for something better. She'd made sure he had what he needed, even when it wasn't much. Every day, she worked long hours at the local hospital, coming home exhausted, but still taking the time to help him with his homework, to make sure he never forgot where he came from. Jalen's mom had always told him that life wasn't about where you started, it was about where you ended up. And while that wasn't always an easy lesson to learn, Jalen took it to heart. She had made sure he knew that no matter what life threw at him, no matter how hard it seemed, he had the power to change his own fate. Even when the world told him, no, even when people looked at him and said, you don't belong here, he could make a way. He just had to be willing to fight for it. It hadn't been easy, of course. The long nights spent studying by the dim light of his lamp, trying to keep up with his classmates who always seemed to have everything figured out. The weekends spent helping his mom at the hospital, running errands for her when she was too tired to do it herself. Jalen had always been a smart kid, he had the kind of mind that could make sense of things others couldn't. But being smart didn't always matter in a place like the South Side. What mattered there was who you knew, and if you could avoid getting caught up in the wrong crowd. Jalen had done his best to stay out of trouble, but it wasn't always easy. Not when his friends would get into fights, or when the neighborhood seemed to constantly be in turmoil. It was his mom who pushed him to apply for the Future Thinkers program. She had heard about it from a coworker, and while it seemed like a long shot, she'd insisted. You never know unless you try, she had said. So, with her encouragement, Jalen filled out the application. He wrote about his love for math, his curiosity about the universe, his dreams of going to a place like Harvard. He knew it was a long shot. But when the acceptance letter came a few months later, Jalen had felt a jolt of disbelief. That disbelief had quickly turned into determination. He wasn't just going to Harvard to check a box, as some people had implied. He was going to show everyone there that he belonged. He wasn't going to sit in the back of the class, quietly blending into the background. He was going to make a name for himself. He was going to prove that he could do the impossible. Now, sitting in his dorm room with the window open and the cool night air coming in, Jalen felt something he had never felt before, hope. Not just for himself, but for everyone back home, for the kids who might never get a chance to be in a place like this. He wanted to be the example that told them that there was another way. That they, too, could break free from the confines of their circumstances. That they, too, could rise above it all. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jalen stood up quickly, the sudden movement making him feel like he was snapping back into reality. He opened the door to find his roommate, Marcus, standing there with a wide grin on his face. Yo, Jalen. Marcus said, pulling his headphones down around his neck. I just saw the video. You're all over the place, man. Everyone's talking about you. The whole school is buzzing about what you said in the lecture today. Jalen smiled, though he didn't feel like celebrating. It wasn't about the attention. It wasn't even about the lecture. It was about something deeper, something more personal. I just did what I had to do, Jalen replied, shrugging. It's just math, man. People get too caught up in thinking it's some kind of secret. Marcus laughed. Yeah, well, you sure have a way of making impossible sound possible. You think the professor's gonna actually listen? Jalen paused. I don't know, he said slowly. But I think we're gonna find out. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's deep, man. You've got big things ahead of you. Jalen didn't answer. He just nodded and closed the door behind him. He didn't need anyone to tell him what he was capable of. He had known all along. It wasn't the praise or the accolades that would define him. It was the work. The ideas. The relentless drive to show everyone, his family, his friends, even the world, that he was more than just a kid from South Side Chicago. He was someone who was willing to challenge the impossible, no matter what anyone else thought. The weeks following that pivotal lecture were a whirlwind for Jalen. What started as a single, bold moment in a classroom at Harvard quickly spiraled into something bigger, much bigger than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the students who were talking about him anymore. It was the faculty. It was the wider academic community. His name began to circulate in academic circles, whispered in halls, typed into emails, and pinned onto discussion boards. Jalen Carter, the 12-year-old boy from South Side Chicago, had challenged the Harvard professor, and perhaps, just perhaps, he was onto something that no one had seen before. But with this newfound attention came something Jalen hadn't fully anticipated: pressure. And it was crushing. He sat in the back of the same lecture hall, now a permanent fixture in Harvard's summer program for gifted students. The atmosphere had shifted. The other students no longer saw him as the curious kid in the back, eager to learn. They saw him as a challenge. He could feel their eyes on him whenever he entered the room, hear their whispers when he passed by. The same students who once ignored him now studied him, dissecting every word he said, every move he made. And that weight, those expectant gazes, began to gnaw at him. Even in the quiet moments, when he was in his dorm room working late into the night, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling of eyes constantly watching. They were watching to see if he would fail. He wasn't just trying to prove himself anymore. He was trying to prove them wrong. In the weeks since his presentation, the entire academic community was waiting for him to make the next move. Professor Strauss, though he hadn't openly criticized Jalen, had made it clear that he expected more than a couple of equations and half-drawn concepts. The expectation now was that Jalen would put together a formal presentation. A groundbreaking solution to a problem that, according to Strauss, had eluded the world's brightest minds for years. And there was more: Jalen was being asked to publish his work. He had been approached by several journals, highly respected ones that only accepted the best of the best. It seemed like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for him to take that next step. The problem was, Jalen wasn't sure if he could. He sat hunched over a set of papers in his dorm room, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating the formulas he had been scribbling down all night. His mind swirled with ideas, but the pieces just weren't clicking into place. He had felt so sure during the lecture that day, but now, things felt different. The equation that had once seemed so simple, so solvable, now felt impossible again. Not because it couldn't be solved, but because there were so many moving parts, so many variables he hadn't accounted for. And every time he thought he had it figured out, a new problem would pop up. Jalen slammed his pencil down on the table, frustration building in his chest. "Why can't I just get this right?" he muttered to himself. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his mom. "Mom, how's it going, champ? I know you're working hard, but don't forget to take care of yourself. We're all rooting for you." A smile tugged at Jalen's lips. He knew his mom was just trying to keep him grounded, but right now, the pressure felt like a weight he couldn't shake. He texted her back quickly. "Jalen, I'm trying, Mom. I'll figure it out." But deep down, he wasn't sure if he would. Later that afternoon, Jalen sat in one of the common areas of the dorms, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had a meeting with Professor Strauss, and it felt like the moment that would decide everything. It wasn't just about impressing the professor anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could do this. Proving that the boy from South Side wasn't just some anomaly, that he could belong here. Among the best, among the brightest. As he walked down the polished hallways of Harvard, Jalen couldn't help but feel small. The other students were talking in hushed tones, laughing and walking past him with their designer backpacks, their polished shoes, their confident strides. Jalen, in his second-hand hoodie and worn sneakers, felt the divide more than ever. These students weren't like him. They didn't know what it was like to grow up in a place where every day felt like a struggle. They didn't know what it was like to wonder if you'd be able to make it out, to question if your dreams were even worth having. And yet, here he was, trying to keep up. Jalen finally made it to Strauss's office. The door was ajar, and inside, the professor was seated behind his large, cluttered desk, shuffling through papers. He didn't look up when Jalen entered. "Sit," Strauss said, his voice cold but not unkind. "Let's talk about your next steps." Jalen hesitated before sitting down in the chair across from Strauss. The professor finally looked up, studying him for a moment. Jalen's heart raced. "First off," Strauss began, "I've been going over your notes. I've had a few of my colleagues look at them too. And frankly, you've made some interesting observations. But there's a problem." Jalen's stomach dropped. "What problem?" "The solution you proposed," Strauss said, "isn't complete. You've missed a few critical variables. You're overestimating the effect of the singularity and underestimating the collapse rates of your proposed model. I'm afraid you'll need to go back to the drawing board." Jalen clenched his fists. He had expected some criticism. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. But hearing it out loud, hearing that he wasn't as close as he thought, felt like a punch to the gut. "I don't understand," Jalen muttered. "I thought I was close." "You were close," Strauss replied. "But close doesn't count in this field. Close doesn't solve the problem. And you need more than a hunch to make it work. You need proof." Jalen nodded slowly, trying to keep his composure. But the doubt crept in again. Was he really capable of this? Could a 12-year-old really solve something this massive? What if Strauss was right? What if he wasn't cut out for this after all? Strauss paused, watching Jalen's face. "But don't get discouraged, Carter. There's potential here. Real potential. Just remember, you don't have to solve it all at once. No one expects you to be perfect. Just keep pushing, and you'll find the way." Jalen nodded, but the words didn't make him feel better. They didn't take away the weight, the overwhelming pressure of being the youngest person in the room, the one who had to prove himself every single day. When he left Strauss's office, the hallway seemed even quieter than before. The weight of the professor's words sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was something else too, a flicker of something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was something sharper. Something that cut through the fog of doubt. Defiance. He wasn't going to quit. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him what he could or couldn't do. He was going to solve this. It didn't matter how hard it got. He would find a way. The pressure weighed heavily on Jalen's chest as he sat in the small library corner of the Harvard campus. He had just left Professor Strauss's office, and the sinking feeling in his stomach hadn't gone away. For the first time in a long while, Jalen doubted himself. He could feel the world around him closing in, and it was hard to focus on anything other than the crushing thought, what if I can't do this? What if I really don't belong here? But the thought didn't stay for long. Jalen quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to give in to doubt. He had come too far. He had come from a place where most kids didn't even have a chance to dream, and now, he was sitting in the heart of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. He wasn't about to throw that away just because of a few setbacks. His fingers drummed lightly on the library desk, his eyes scanning over the books and papers laid out in front of him. The problem Strauss had mentioned kept replaying in his mind, like a loop he couldn't turn off. Jalen knew he needed a breakthrough, but he couldn't see it. Not yet. But the truth was, there was something inside him, something deep in his bones, that told him he could solve it. He just needed to find a new way. A better way. That night, as the sky outside turned dark and the campus grew quieter, Jalen found himself pacing in the small library. The equations weren't making sense, and the more he thought about Strauss's words, the more he realized how vast the problem was. It wasn't just a simple calculation or an overlooked variable. No, this was bigger than that. Much bigger. Jalen was trying to make sense of a complex theory in quantum physics, one that even the brightest minds at Harvard had struggled with for years. It was a concept involving the relationship between gravitational waves and quantum entanglement, and the potential consequences that could occur if they were ever bridged. The formula had eluded even the best professors in the field, and here he was, 12 years old and expected to crack it. He rubbed his eyes, his fingers aching from hours of scribbling in his notebook. The room was empty except for a few scattered students studying for finals, their murmurs distant echoes in the background. His mind was racing, the thoughts coming faster than he could process them. And yet, there was something strange about this moment. It wasn't just frustration, there was a strange kind of excitement. For the first time in days, Jalen felt a sense of clarity, something was about to click, he could feel it. Suddenly, it hit him. Not in a flash of genius, not like the sudden realization he had in class weeks ago, but as a quiet, steady thought that worked its way into his consciousness. Jalen realized that he had been trying to approach the problem from the wrong angle. The equations weren't the problem, the approach was. It was as if the solution had always been there, but he had been looking in the wrong direction. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching a new diagram, one he hadn't even considered before. It wasn't just about the variables. It was about understanding the relationship between them in a completely new way. He drew connections, placed variables into new positions, and slowly but surely, something began to take shape. As the hours ticked by, Jalen's initial sense of frustration gave way to a quiet focus. He was no longer trying to force the solution to come to him, instead, he was letting the problem evolve in front of him, letting the pieces fall into place naturally. Every once in a while, he would stop and glance around the library. The world felt distant now. It was just him, the pages, and the growing understanding of the problem at hand. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, long after the other students had left for their dorms, that Jalen finally set his pen down. He looked at the sheet in front of him, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. The diagram he had drawn was more than just a series of calculations, it was a roadmap, a blueprint to understanding the relationship between quantum mechanics and gravitational waves. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the final solution yet. But it was progress. Jalen stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for hours, and walked over to the large whiteboard in the corner of the room. He started transcribing the equations from the paper, adding notes as he went, his mind constantly shifting and rearranging the variables. He could feel his pulse quicken with every new realization. With each moment, the answer grew clearer, more within his reach. By the time the sun began to rise, casting its first light through the library windows, Jalen had a sense of something he hadn't had in days, hope. But this was only the beginning. He knew there would be more work to do. He knew the next steps wouldn't be easy. But for the first time since meeting with Professor Strauss, Jalen felt like he was moving forward again, not weighed down by the impossible. He glanced at the clock. It was time to go to class, but Jalen knew he couldn't rest yet. He had to get this right. There was still so much to do. As he walked back to his dorm, his mind raced with calculations and possibilities. The journey was far from over, but Jalen couldn't help feeling a sense of anticipation in his chest. For the first time in his life, he was embarking on something bigger than himself, something that could change everything. The rest of the students at Harvard may have seen him as just another kid, a boy from a rough neighborhood with a mind that didn't quite belong, but in that moment, Jalen realized something crucial. He didn't have to prove anything to them. He wasn't doing this for their approval. He was doing this for himself. For his family. For every kid in South Side who had ever been told they couldn't make it. He was going to prove that anything was possible. The week that followed was a blur of sleepless nights and frantic days. Jalen could feel the weight of his work pressing down on him, heavier than before. The breakthrough from the library had given him something to hold on to, but as the days went on, it felt like the further he got, the more he realized just how much further there was to go. Every answer led to more questions, every solution opened up a new set of problems. The theory was expanding, growing in complexity, like a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together the way he had imagined. It was Tuesday morning when he found himself back in Professor Strauss's office, hands clenched in his lap, his stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The time had come. He had worked through every variable, adjusted every formula, and rearranged the pieces of the theory until they felt just right. This was it. This was the moment that could define everything. But even as Jalen walked into the room, he couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if the work he had put in, the countless hours, the sleepless nights, wasn't enough to make the grade? Professor Strauss was sitting at his desk again, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up as Jalen entered, offering a thin smile. "Well, Carter. Ready to show me what you've got?" Jalen took a deep breath, nodded, and placed his papers on the desk. The sound of them sliding across the wood echoed in the quiet room. His hands were trembling slightly, despite his efforts to steady them. "I think I've figured it out," Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I have the solution." Professor Strauss didn't speak immediately. Instead, he motioned for Jalen to explain, his sharp eyes never leaving the boy's face. Jalen felt like he was being examined, scrutinized down to his very core. He began to speak, outlining the new approach he had developed, explaining how he had rearranged the equation, how he had connected the variables in a way that no one else had thought of before. At first, Strauss was silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jalen could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of Strauss's pen scratching against the paper as he took notes. Jalen's heart pounded in his chest. And then, finally, Strauss looked up. His expression was unreadable. "Well, Carter," he said slowly. "This is certainly interesting." Jalen's stomach dropped. That wasn't exactly the response he had been hoping for. "You've managed to take a new angle," Strauss continued, leaning back in his chair. "I can see the potential in your work, but," he paused, glancing at Jalen with a scrutinizing gaze. "There's a fundamental flaw in your hypothesis. It's not a matter of calculation, but of principle. You're missing a critical component, one that could make or break this entire theory." Jalen felt his heart skip a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Another flaw? What's missing?" Jalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. Strauss took a deep breath, steepling his fingers in front of him. "You've got the theory almost right, but the core concept is flawed. You're not accounting for the inherent unpredictability of the quantum field. There are too many variables at play here. And no matter how precise you are with your equations, they won't hold up in the face of such uncertainty." Jalen blinked, trying to process the information. He had come so close. All the work, the sleepless nights, it all seemed so pointless now. He looked down at the papers in front of him. The equations he had written, the diagrams, the notes, it all felt like it had been for nothing. For a brief moment, his mind went blank. He thought about giving up. About walking out of this office, leaving the theory and Harvard behind, and never looking back. He was 12 years old, for heaven's sake. What was he even doing here? "You're a gifted kid, Jalen," Strauss said, his tone softening. "And I don't say that lightly. But sometimes, even the most brilliant minds need to take a step back. It's not about being right, it's about being ready to make mistakes. And from what I'm seeing here, you're not quite ready yet." Those words stung, more than Jalen would ever admit to anyone. He had thought he could do it. He had thought he was close to the answer. But now, in the face of Strauss's cold, objective critique, he felt small. Like an imposter. He had been trying to prove something to himself, something bigger than just a theory. He had been trying to prove that a 12-year-old kid from the South Side could do something that no one thought was possible. But now, he wasn't sure if he could even prove it to himself. "Do you think I'm just a kid?" Jalen found himself asking, before he could stop himself. His voice was thick, betraying the emotions he had tried to keep in check for so long. Strauss looked at him, his face softening. "No, Jalen. I think you're a young person with incredible potential. But potential doesn't always translate into immediate success. Sometimes, you need to fail to learn. And sometimes, you need to understand that failure is part of the process." The words hit him harder than anything else. He had never really understood failure before. Growing up, failure had been a constant. But now, it was something he had to confront again, and this time, it was different. This failure wasn't just a poor grade on a test or an argument with a friend, it felt like the crushing weight of a dream slipping through his fingers. Jalen stood up suddenly, his eyes stinging with the beginnings of unshed tears. "I understand," he said, his voice catching. "I'll try again." As he turned to leave, Strauss called after him. "Jalen," he said, his tone no longer cold, but something softer. "I believe in you. But I also think you need time. Time to grow. Time to let the theory breathe. You've got the right instincts, but you can't rush the process. Let it unfold." The door clicked shut behind Jalen, and for a moment, he just stood there in the hallway. The weight of everything pressed down on him. He had felt so close. So close to proving himself. And now, it felt like all of it had been ripped away. But then, in the midst of the despair, a small voice inside him spoke up. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. "You've come too far to quit now." Jalen swallowed hard, wiping his eyes quickly, and for the first time in days, he took a deep, steadying breath. He wasn't done. He wouldn't be done. Not yet. Jalen sat alone in his dorm room, staring at the empty wall in front of him. The silence around him felt suffocating, like the weight of the entire world was pressing down on him. His thoughts kept circling back to Professor Strauss's words, and no matter how hard he tried to push them away, they lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. "I'm not ready yet. I still have so much to learn." But Jalen couldn't just let it go. He had spent too much time working toward this, too much time pushing through the doubt and fear to stop now. He couldn't quit. Not when he had come this far. His hands were trembling, but he knew what he had to do. He grabbed his notebook and flipped to the pages where he had written out his equations, the ones Strauss had criticized. Jalen had spent so much time focused on the details, the numbers, the variables, but now, something inside him told him that he needed to take a step back. He needed to see the bigger picture. The answers weren't in the numbers, not entirely. They were in the way he approached the problem. In the way he allowed the theory to breathe, as Strauss had said. Maybe he had been too quick to force a solution, too eager to prove himself. He had to slow down. Think. Breathe. Jalen closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He needed clarity. And so, he let his mind wander, reflecting on everything that had brought him here. The early mornings spent studying at the local library back in Chicago, the nights he'd stayed up late helping his little sister with her homework, the day he had first been accepted to Harvard, all of it had led him to this point. But it wasn't just the academic pressure that weighed on him. It was the pressure of proving himself to his community, to his family, and to everyone who had ever doubted him. He thought of his mom. The sacrifices she had made to get him into this school. She had never been able to help him with his homework in the way other parents did. She had never been able to sit down and teach him the things she knew. But she had always believed in him. She had always told him that if he worked hard enough, if he stayed focused, there was nothing he couldn't achieve. He thought of his friends back home in the South Side, how proud they would be if they knew what he was doing. How proud they would be of the kid who had made it, who was going to change the world. Jalen felt a surge of warmth in his chest. He was doing this for them. And for himself. For the boy who had once sat in a classroom, dreaming of something bigger, something more. This wasn't just about solving a problem in quantum physics. It was about showing everyone, including himself, that he could do it. That he was capable. That his dreams weren't limited by where he came from. He picked up his pen again, his hand more steady now. He didn't start with the equations. He didn't dive straight into the numbers. He started with the theory, the big idea. He allowed the variables to exist in space, to move in ways he hadn't considered before. He gave them room to breathe. As he worked, he felt his mind begin to calm. The weight of the pressure that had clouded his thoughts lifted just a little. Hours passed, and Jalen lost track of time. His pencil scratched across the paper, his thoughts flowing more freely than they had in days. It wasn't about finding a quick fix. It was about finding the truth. And then, somewhere in the middle of the night, it happened. The pieces finally clicked into place. The solution wasn't about forcing the variables to fit into a neat formula. It was about understanding the relationships between them, seeing the subtle connections, the way the quantum field responded to gravitational waves. The new diagram Jalen had drawn began to make sense, and as he filled in the details, everything fell into alignment. The theory, which had once seemed so impenetrable, began to breathe, and with it, Jalen saw the answer he had been searching for all along. He sat back in his chair, staring at the paper in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The problem had been solved. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but it was a breakthrough. The kind of breakthrough that could change the way people thought about the universe. The kind of breakthrough that could make everything he had worked for feel worth it. Jalen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He had done it. He had solved the problem. But there was more. There was still work to do. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Jalen stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for hours, and grabbed his jacket. He needed to show this to someone who could understand what he had done. He couldn't keep this to himself. He had to share it. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and dialed Professor Strauss's number. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, unsure, but he pressed the call button anyway. The phone rang once, twice, before Strauss picked up. "Carter?" Strauss's voice was groggy, as if he had just woken up. "I think I've got it," Jalen said, his voice shaking with excitement. "I think I've found the answer. The solution to the theory. I need you to look at it." There was a long pause on the other end, and Jalen could hear the sound of Strauss moving around in his chair. "You want me to look at it now?" he asked, sounding both surprised and intrigued. "Yes," Jalen said, his voice steady now. "I think it's time." "All right, send it over. I'll take a look at it. And we'll talk tomorrow." The call ended, and Jalen sat there, his heart racing. He had done it. He had solved the impossible. It wasn't just about the breakthrough itself, it was about everything he had learned along the way. The long nights, the self-doubt, the feeling of being lost. It had all led him here, to this moment of triumph. Jalen looked out the window at the dark sky. It was still early in the morning, and the world was just beginning to stir. He had solved the problem. He had proved to himself that nothing was impossible. And now, he was ready for the next challenge. For the first time in a long while, Jalen felt at peace. He had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. The next few days passed in a haze of excitement and anticipation. Jalen couldn't quite believe that he had done it, had actually cracked the code that had eluded so many brilliant minds before him. But as the initial rush of accomplishment began to settle, a new reality started to sink in. He hadn't just solved a theoretical problem. He had opened a door to something bigger. Something that could change the course of scientific understanding. The first person he had called was Professor Strauss. When the professor had told him to send the solution over, Jalen did just that, along with an email full of notes detailing the steps he had taken to arrive at the breakthrough. He couldn't help but feel nervous as he hit send. What if Strauss didn't see it the way he did? What if the professor dismissed it as nothing more than an accident, a fluke? A couple of hours later, Jalen's phone buzzed. It was an email from Professor Strauss. Jalen. I've reviewed your work, and I must admit, I'm impressed. You've not only addressed the immediate flaws, but you've also managed to introduce a perspective I had overlooked. There are still a few details we need to fine-tune, but this is a promising breakthrough. I'd like to meet with you in person to discuss this further. I think we're onto something big here. Let's meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. in my office. Professor Strauss. Jalen read the email over and over, barely able to believe what he was seeing. The words were like music to his ears. Strauss had recognized it. He had acknowledged his work. For the first time, Jalen truly felt like he was on the path to something extraordinary. The problem wasn't just about the solution anymore, it was about the journey. The world was beginning to take notice. The next morning, Jalen walked into Strauss's office with a sense of purpose. The meeting was not just a formality now, it was the next step in something far bigger than a single problem or theory. It was the beginning of something that could change the course of his life. Professor Strauss was already sitting behind his desk when Jalen entered. The professor gestured for him to sit. Carter, Strauss said, looking up from the notes he had been reviewing. First of all, let me say this, you've done something remarkable. What you've done here is nothing short of groundbreaking. You've taken a concept that has stumped even the brightest minds in the field and found a way to navigate around it. That's no small feat. Jalen felt his chest swell with pride, but he kept his voice steady. Thank you, Professor. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Strauss nodded thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing in a way that made Jalen feel like he was being weighed and measured. I'm not the one who solved it, Jalen. You did. And that's why I want to talk about what comes next. Jalen leaned forward slightly, eager to hear what the professor had to say. He had expected to get feedback, suggestions for improvement, but he wasn't prepared for what Strauss said next. I think it's time to bring this work to a wider audience. This isn't just a theoretical breakthrough. It has the potential to shake up the entire field of quantum physics. But for that to happen, you're going to need to present your findings in front of people who can understand its significance. You're ready for this, Jalen. Jalen blinked. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, each one sinking deeper into his chest. He wasn't just ready to present his work to Professor Strauss anymore. He was being asked to step onto a bigger stage, a stage where experts, professors, and possibly even the world's scientific community would scrutinize his ideas. You mean, you want me to present this to other scientists? Jalen asked, his voice almost a whisper. Exactly, Strauss replied. You've got a rare gift, Jalen. You've shown more than just academic brilliance. You've shown creativity, persistence, and a deep understanding of the subject. It's time for the world to see it. It's time for you to stand in front of the brightest minds in the field and show them what you've done. The weight of Strauss's words hung over him, and for a moment, Jalen was paralyzed. What if they didn't take him seriously? What if they laughed him off? The anxiety gnawed at him like a relentless force, but he fought it back. Okay, Jalen said, more to himself than to Strauss. Okay. I'll do it. Strauss smiled, a genuine expression of encouragement. Good. We'll prepare you for the presentation. It won't be easy, but you're ready. I'll help you, of course. But remember, this is your moment. You've earned it. As Jalen walked out of Strauss's office, his mind raced. The reality of what was about to happen started to hit him with a powerful force. He was going to present his work to some of the smartest people in the world. People who had spent their lives studying things he had only just begun to grasp. And if they accepted it, if they recognized his breakthrough, it would be a moment he could never take back. He needed to prepare. The clock was ticking, and he had no time to waste. For the next few days, Jalen immersed himself in preparation. He pored over his notes, refined his presentation, and rehearsed his speech over and over again. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but if there was one thing he had learned, it was that nothing worth achieving came without hard work. One evening, after hours of practicing in front of his mirror, Jalen paused to take a break. He sat on his bed, staring at the notebook in his hands. A part of him still couldn't believe what was happening. He was a 12-year-old kid from the south side of Chicago. How had he ended up here, about to present his work to some of the most accomplished scientists in the world? But then, something clicked. The reason he had made it this far wasn't because of his age or his background. It wasn't because he was trying to prove something to anyone else. It was because he believed in his work. He had taken a problem that seemed impossible and broken it down into something tangible. He had found a solution because he had refused to give up. And now, it was time to share that solution with the world. The morning of the presentation arrived faster than Jalen had expected. As the sun began to rise over Cambridge, casting a soft glow across the campus, he stood in front of the mirror in his dorm room, adjusting his tie. His heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the moment felt unbearable. He was about to stand in front of a room full of scientists, experts in quantum physics, many of whom had decades of experience. He was just a 12-year-old kid, and yet he was about to present an idea that could change everything. The fact that he was about to address some of the most brilliant minds in the world was not lost on him. Professor Strauss had arranged for Jalen to present his findings at a prestigious conference that was being held at Harvard that very day. The room would be filled with the leading figures in the field of physics, all eager to see the next great scientific breakthrough. And Jalen's breakthrough, the one he had worked so hard for, would be the centerpiece of it all. Jalen checked his notes for the 100th time, making sure everything was in order. His presentation was clear. His findings were solid. His arguments were sound. But as the minutes ticked by, the uncertainty began to creep in. What if they don't believe me? What if they laugh me off the stage? The thought kept gnawing at him. It was one thing to impress Professor Strauss, but this was different. These were the experts, the titans of the field. He could almost hear his mom's voice in his head. You can do anything you put your mind to. He had carried her words with him every step of the way. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. And now, he had to believe in her faith in him, even when doubt threatened to overtake him. With one last deep breath, Jalen grabbed his notebook and headed for the conference hall. As he made his way across the campus, he noticed that the sky had cleared, and the bright blue overhead seemed to offer a sense of calm. Maybe it was the universe's way of telling him that everything would be okay. When he entered the auditorium, he was greeted by the sight of rows upon rows of chairs filled with people, all busy chatting and reading over their own notes. At the front of the room stood a large projector screen, and at the podium, Professor Strauss was already setting up his materials. Jalen, Strauss called when he saw him. Glad you could make it. You're up next. You ready? Jalen forced a smile. I think so. Strauss gave him a nod of reassurance. You've got this. Just remember, be confident in what you've done. You've earned this moment. Trust yourself. The room fell into a hushed silence as Strauss stepped away from the podium, and Jalen took his place. He adjusted the microphone, feeling the eyes of the audience on him. There were at least 50 people in the room, some he recognized, most he didn't. All of them were experts in their own right. This was no ordinary lecture. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. His mind briefly flashed to the doubts that had crept in during his long nights of studying. What if I mess up? What if they don't understand me? But as he looked around the room, he took a deep breath and pushed those thoughts aside. The work he had done was important. The breakthrough he had made was real. He wasn't just here because of his age or the novelty of his story. He was here because his ideas mattered. He clicked a button on the remote, and the first slide of his presentation appeared on the large screen. The title read, The Quantum Puzzle, new solutions for gravitational interactions in quantum field theory. For a moment, the room was silent. Everyone was staring at the screen, waiting. And then, Jalen began. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice shaking only slightly. "My name is Jalen Carter, and I'm here to present a breakthrough in quantum physics. A theory that addresses a long-standing issue in our understanding of gravitational interactions." He paused, glancing at the audience. Some faces were skeptical, others intrigued. Strauss was sitting at the front, his arms crossed, watching with keen interest. "This theory," Jalen continued, "explores the relationship between quantum fields and gravity, particularly in the context of how gravitational waves interact with quantum particles. The conventional model of quantum physics has been limited by certain assumptions, particularly in how gravity, traditionally understood through general relativity, affects quantum fields at subatomic levels." Jalen advanced to the next slide, which showed a diagram of the quantum field and its interaction with gravitational waves. He pointed to the image, explaining the key points with clarity. He'd spent countless hours making sure every detail was correct, every relationship between the variables precise. As Jalen spoke, he could feel the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The words came easier now. He was no longer focused on the faces in the crowd or the fear of being judged. He was immersed in the theory, the work he had done. "The breakthrough here," Jalen said, "lies in the discovery that the gravitational field is not just a passive participant in the interaction between quantum fields and spacetime. It plays an active role in shaping the way quantum particles behave. In essence, we've been looking at gravity all wrong. It's not an isolated force acting only on massive objects. It's a dynamic component in the fabric of quantum reality, influencing particles in ways we didn't fully understand before." Jalen advanced to the next slide, and the room remained wrapped in attention. His confidence grew with every word. He explained the mathematical equations, the experimental data he had referenced, and how his model accounted for phenomena that had previously been ignored by the scientific community. And then, just as he was about to explain the final piece of the puzzle, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the back of the room. "Excuse me, young man," a deep voice called out. "Are you suggesting that quantum fields are influenced by gravitational forces in a way that fundamentally changes our understanding of black holes and dark matter?" Jalen turned toward the voice. An older man with silver hair and a sharp, angular face stood in the back of the room, his arms crossed. The skepticism in his eyes was unmistakable. Jalen's heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment the audience would turn against him? But instead of faltering, Jalen took a deep breath and nodded. "Exactly," he said, meeting the man's gaze. "This model could open up new avenues for understanding black holes and dark matter, as well as the elusive nature of quantum gravity. It suggests that gravity is not merely a force that bends spacetime, but a dynamic force that interacts with quantum fields at a fundamental level." There was a moment of silence. Jalen could feel the tension building in the room, but he didn't back down. The questions from the audience weren't dismissals. They were challenges. And he welcomed them. The older man studied Jalen for a moment before nodding slowly. "Impressive. Go on." And with that, the room fell silent once again, waiting for Jalen to continue. The room was thick with tension as Jalen continued his presentation. The challenge from the man in the back, though it had initially sent a jolt of panic through him, now served to fuel his determination. This was no longer just about proving himself to a group of people, it was about standing firm in the validity of his work. He knew what he had uncovered, and it was time to stand by it, no matter how much pressure he felt from the weight of skepticism. As the older man stood in the back, waiting for Jalen's response, the rest of the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The silence stretched, but Jalen didn't break. He had come this far by trusting in the validity of his ideas, and he wasn't about to let doubt undermine him now. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked through his slides, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "Yes," Jalen replied, his voice steady. What I'm suggesting is that gravitational forces are not passive when it comes to quantum fields. In fact, they're an active participant in shaping how particles behave, which in turn influences everything from quantum entanglement to the behavior of dark matter and black holes. There was another beat of silence, then the older man nodded again, though his expression was unreadable. Slowly, he walked down the aisle toward the front of the room, his eyes fixed on the screen. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and Jalen felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety. This was a pivotal moment. The response of the audience could shape the trajectory of his future, and the future of his breakthrough. Professor Strauss, who had been watching from the front of the room, leaned forward slightly. Jalen could sense the professor's approval, but he could also feel the subtle tension in the air. Strauss had been preparing him for something like this. There would be skepticism. There would be hard questions. But there was also a chance that, if he answered well enough, he could solidify his place in this world of elite thinkers. The older man reached the front of the room, still contemplating the presentation. He turned toward Jalen with a slight furrow in his brow. "Your theory," he began, "suggests that gravity interacts with quantum fields at a much deeper level than we've ever considered. But if that's true, how do you account for the behavior of particles in quantum systems where gravity has a negligible effect?" Jalen felt a rush of relief. This wasn't a rejection, it was an invitation to explain. He had been prepared for this. He had run through countless scenarios, imagining the toughest questions, formulating his answers. The key point here, Jalen said, is that gravity's role becomes significant when you're dealing with very high-energy systems, particularly in environments where the density of particles is extremely high, like near black holes or within the cores of stars. In low-energy environments, such as within the depths of a laboratory, gravity's influence is indeed negligible, but at the quantum level, especially at extremely small scales, it's still part of the equation. The interactions I'm proposing have been overlooked because traditional models have treated gravity as a separate entity from quantum mechanics. My work integrates the two, suggesting that gravity may act on a quantum level, altering the behavior of particles in ways we've yet to fully understand. Jalen paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. The older man nodded slowly, clearly mulling over the response. He glanced toward the others in the room, who were all listening intently. There was a quiet murmur among the audience as they began to turn their attention to the implications of what Jalen had just said. "Well, young man," the older man said, his voice low but filled with curiosity, "you may be onto something. But you'll need more than just theoretical analysis to convince the broader scientific community. You'll need experiments, data that backs up your claim." Jalen nodded, his heart pounding as he recognized the challenge. It was exactly what he had expected, and exactly what he had hoped for, an opportunity to take the theory further, to put it into action. "I agree," Jalen said. "I've been working with Professor Strauss on designing an experiment to test the model's predictions. We're in the process of refining the methodology, but the early data looks promising." The older man's eyes gleamed with interest. "Very well. I look forward to seeing the results. You've got the right approach, now it's a matter of following through with rigorous testing. Theoretical models are only as good as the data that supports them." Jalen's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment of validation. Not only had he explained his theory clearly, but he had also opened the door to further exploration. The older man had shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism, and that was a huge victory in itself. Professor Strauss, who had been observing quietly, now spoke up. "Jalen's proposal is just the beginning. If we can test these hypotheses and generate data that supports this theory, we could very well be on the verge of a new era in physics. And that's what makes this so exciting. It's not just about solving one problem, it's about reshaping our entire understanding of the universe." As Strauss's words settled over the room, Jalen could feel the excitement building. This was more than a single theory, it was a challenge to everything they had ever known about physics. It was the start of something that could change the field forever. For the next hour, Jalen fielded questions from the audience. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. The questions grew more technical, diving deeper into the implications of his findings. But Jalen answered each one with confidence. He had prepared for this. Each answer felt like another step toward proving his breakthrough was real, and each nod of approval from the experts made him feel more sure of himself. When the session finally ended, Professor Strauss approached him with a proud smile. "You did it, Jalen. You handled yourself brilliantly. The presentation was flawless, and your answers were spot on." Jalen smiled, but he couldn't fully bask in the praise just yet. His mind was still racing, still thinking about the next steps. "Thanks, Professor. But we're not done. We need to prove this. The real work is just beginning." Strauss nodded. "Exactly. But you've done more than anyone expected, Jalen. You've opened the door to something incredible. Now, we walk through it." As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of excitement filled the room. The experts were talking about his theory, debating its potential. Jalen felt a rush of accomplishment mixed with a new, exhilarating sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a moment for him, it was a moment for science. His work had made an impact. And now, it was time to see where it would go. Jalen's mind raced with possibilities in the days following the presentation. The questions he had received from the scientific community were no longer a source of anxiety. Instead, they had ignited a new sense of purpose within him. He had successfully gotten their attention, and now it was time to back up his theory with hard evidence. The journey was far from over. If anything, this was just the beginning. But one thing was clear. He was no longer just the 12-year-old prodigy. He was a scientist in his own right, on the precipice of a breakthrough that could change the landscape of quantum physics forever. Professor Strauss was by his side every step of the way, guiding him through the next crucial phase, experimentation. Jalen had spent years studying theory, but now it was time to test the ideas that had been running through his head for so long. The theory was no longer just a set of equations and abstract concepts. It was a real thing that needed to be tested, measured, and analyzed. The first step in their journey was to prepare the experiment. Professor Strauss had connections at a high-tech laboratory in the heart of Cambridge, one that specialized in quantum mechanics and particle physics. The lab had state-of-the-art equipment, including particle accelerators and quantum detectors, which would be crucial for testing Jalen's theory about gravity's role in quantum fields. Jalen's excitement grew as they prepared for the first phase of experimentation. It was a rare opportunity to work with such sophisticated equipment. Most scientists spent years just gaining access to these kinds of resources. Jalen, on the other hand, was stepping in as a 12-year-old with a groundbreaking idea that had already captivated some of the most prominent physicists in the world. The lab was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Scientists and technicians were moving swiftly between stations, their lab coats billowing as they ran tests on different components. The air was thick with the hum of high-tech machinery. Jalen felt a jolt of awe and excitement as he entered the space. "This is where the magic happens," Strauss said with a grin, gesturing to the array of equipment surrounding them. "But remember, Jalen, science isn't about magic. It's about precision, repetition, and scrutiny. We've got to get this right." Jalen nodded, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. It wasn't about proving that he could be right, it was about ensuring the experiment was flawless. After all, if his theory was wrong, the data would show it. He could handle that. What mattered was getting the truth. They spent the next few days calibrating the equipment, ensuring that every measurement would be accurate. The first test would involve running a series of simulations based on Jalen's theoretical model. They would simulate the interaction between quantum fields and gravity in environments where gravitational forces were traditionally thought to be negligible. It was in these environments that Jalen predicted gravity would still have a noticeable impact on quantum particles. It was early in the morning when they ran their first trial. Jalen stood beside Strauss as they watched the data stream across the computer screens. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to input any necessary adjustments. The sound of the machines whirring filled the room, blending with the clicking of keys and the occasional murmur of the technicians. The first few tests didn't show any remarkable results. The data appeared stable, predictable. Gravity seemed to behave in the expected way, aligning with the standard models that had been in place for decades. It was frustrating, but Jalen refused to be discouraged. Science was rarely a straight line from hypothesis to conclusion. They would have to run multiple simulations, adjust variables, and try different approaches until they found what they were looking for. By the fourth day of experiments, they had run numerous simulations, each revealing similar results. The gravitational forces remained consistent with what was expected, until one crucial variable was altered. Jalen had hypothesized that in very specific conditions, such as those found near extremely dense quantum fields or in the presence of high-energy particles, gravity could behave in ways the standard models hadn't predicted. The data from the first few tests hadn't confirmed this, but Jalen had a hunch that they were missing something. He suggested an adjustment to one of the variables, something that had initially been overlooked. What if we adjust the quantum field density slightly, and see if that changes the results, he suggested to Professor Strauss. Strauss raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting thought. It might give us more insight into how gravity behaves when pushed to the edge of the quantum scale. Let's give it a try. With a few keystrokes, the team adjusted the simulation's parameters to increase the quantum field density. They ran the test once more, watching the data unfold. This time, something different happened. The data began to shift. Small fluctuations in the gravitational field were now observable. They weren't huge, but they were undeniable. Gravity, in this particular quantum state, was having an effect on the particles. It was subtle, but it was there. It was exactly what Jalen had predicted. "Professor, look at this," Jalen said, pointing to the screen. "The gravitational forces are affecting the quantum particles. It's not a huge shift, but it's measurable." Professor Strauss leaned in, eyes wide with excitement. This is it. This is exactly what you were talking about. Gravity is interacting with the quantum field in ways we've never seen before." The room went silent as they all stared at the screen, watching the data unfold in real time. Jalen's heart raced in his chest as he realized that this was the moment. The theory was no longer just a hypothesis. It was beginning to take shape in the real world. But even as the data confirmed his theory, a voice in the back of his mind reminded him, this was just the first step. There would be more tests to run, more variables to adjust. And the scientific community wasn't going to take this revelation on faith alone. They would want results. They would want proof. But Jalen wasn't afraid. In that moment, with the data solidifying what he had known all along, he felt the first true stirrings of victory. His breakthrough wasn't just a theory anymore, it was science. And science was about discovery, about pushing boundaries, about proving the unimaginable. "I think we're onto something big," Jalen said, his voice steady and filled with determination. Strauss placed a hand on his shoulder, his pride evident. "No. You've already done something big. Now, let's see how far this thing can go." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Jalen, now under the watchful eye of Professor Strauss, had to focus on refining the experiment's results and preparing for the moment that would truly test his theory, presenting the findings to the scientific community. It was one thing to demonstrate an idea in the privacy of a laboratory, it was another to stand before the world and stake everything on the evidence. Jalen knew this moment would be pivotal, he could not afford any mistakes. Their first step was to compile their findings into a detailed paper, which they would submit to a prestigious scientific journal. The paper had to be perfect, every data point, every equation, every observation. The truth of Jalen's breakthrough, the idea that gravity could affect quantum fields in previously unimaginable ways, had to be articulated with clarity and precision. Professor Strauss was meticulous, guiding Jalen through the process of writing the paper. Together, They broke down the data and explained the significance of the results. But even as they worked, the magnitude of what they were doing began to settle in. Jalen wasn't just working on a college-level project anymore. He was about to change the very foundation of how scientists understood the universe. Finally, after days of reviewing and rechecking, the paper was ready. It was titled The Gravitational Quantum Field Interaction, a New Model of Particle Dynamics, a simple title, but one that carried the weight of a world-altering discovery. Professor Strauss gave Jalen a long look, his eyes glinting with pride and excitement. "This is it, Jalen. We've done it. We're ready." Jalen could feel his heartbeat in his throat. This was the moment. But even as his excitement mounted, a knot of nervousness twisted in his stomach. Would the world embrace this new paradigm? Would they accept his theories, or would they dismiss him, the 12-year-old prodigy, as an outsider? He had seen it before. Young minds were often dismissed in the world of science, no matter how brilliant their ideas. The paper was submitted to the Journal of Theoretical Physics, one of the most respected journals in the field. The waiting period began, and each day that passed felt like an eternity to Jalen. He pored over the results, reanalyzing every number and double-checking every assumption. The smallest mistake could invalidate the entire theory. He couldn't afford to be wrong now. Weeks later, the email came. Jalen was sitting at his computer when the notification flashed across the screen: "Decision, major revision requested." His heart stopped for a moment. He clicked the email open, bracing himself for the worst. But as he read, the words began to sink in. The journal's reviewers had acknowledged the significance of his findings. They were impressed by the data and the model, but they wanted further clarification in certain areas, and additional tests to strengthen the evidence. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, but it was far better than a rejection. They were asking for more, because they believed in the potential of his theory. Jalen exhaled, a mix of relief and exhilaration flooding over him. This was the beginning of something monumental. "I knew it," Professor Strauss said, slapping Jalen on the back. "You've made your mark. Now it's just a matter of proving it." Over the next several months, Jalen and Professor Strauss worked tirelessly to address the reviewers' concerns. They ran more tests, gathered additional data, and refined the model even further. Each experiment brought new challenges, but Jalen felt an unshakable sense of purpose. This was his moment to change the way the world understood physics. One day, as Jalen was reviewing the final round of revisions, he received an invitation that sent a rush of excitement through his body. It was from the International Conference on Advanced Physics, one of the most prestigious events in the scientific world. They wanted him to present his findings. This wasn't just any conference, it was the stage where the leading minds in science gathered to discuss groundbreaking research. Jalen couldn't believe it. An invitation to present at such a high-profile conference? It was unheard of for someone his age. Most scientists would wait decades for such an opportunity, but here he was, only 12 years old, about to present the most significant breakthrough in modern physics in front of the very people who had once doubted him. Jalen spent the next few weeks preparing his presentation with even greater care. He had already gone through hundreds of slides for his lab's internal discussions, but this was different. The world would be watching. The scientists in the audience would not hesitate to challenge him, to poke holes in his theory. He had to be ready for anything. Finally, the day arrived. The conference hall in Berlin was filled with experts from around the world, each one eager to hear the latest developments in the world of physics. Jalen stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the array of scientists talking, debating, and discussing with fervor. This was where the giants of physics walked, people like Stephen Hawking, Carl Sagan, and others whose names were etched into the history of science. Now, Jalen was about to take the stage with them. Professor Strauss stood beside him, offering a comforting smile. "You've got this, Jalen. Just remember, this isn't just about proving them wrong. It's about opening their minds to something new. You've already done the hard work. Now, you just need to tell the world about it. Jalen nodded, his nerves still there but tempered by a sense of determination. He wasn't just presenting his work to prove himself. He was presenting it because the world needed to see it. As he stepped out onto the stage, the applause from the audience seemed distant at first. The sea of faces blurred, but Jalen focused on his slides. He could feel his heart race, but his voice was calm and steady as he began speaking. The audience was quiet, listening intently as he described his theory, the data that supported it, and the potential implications for the future of physics. His hands were steady as he moved through the slides, detailing every experiment, every test result, and every shift in the data that supported his groundbreaking discovery. He spoke about how gravity interacted with quantum fields in ways that defied traditional models, about how this new understanding could change everything from black hole research to the study of dark matter. He was met with occasional nods from the audience, acknowledging that, while his ideas were unconventional, they were backed by data. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then, a question rang out from the back of the hall. "You're proposing a model that defies some of the most established principles in modern physics. Why should we believe that this is real? What makes this different from all the failed theories that have come before?" Jalen's eyes flickered to the back of the room. The voice came from a tall, imposing figure, a man with gray hair and glasses, his expression unreadable. It was Professor Walker, one of the most respected theoretical physicists in the world. The question was sharp, direct, and filled with challenge. Jalen took a deep breath. Because the data supports it. The tests, the simulations, they all point to the same conclusion. Gravity is not just a force acting on a macro scale. It's an active participant in the quantum field. We've always separated the two, but the evidence shows that they are connected in ways we never thought possible. This isn't just another failed theory. It's the beginning of something new. The room was quiet again, but this time, Jalen felt a shift. The challenge wasn't just to refute him, it was to understand the implications of what he was proposing. And that, in itself, was a victory. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Jalen's presentation were a blur. The reaction from the scientific community was swift, and it was nothing short of overwhelming. The invitation to present at the International Conference on Advanced Physics had been a monumental step, but it was what happened afterward that truly changed the course of his life. The debate about his theory, which had been controversial even before his presentation, was now in full swing. Jalen was thrust into the center of the storm, and while the attention was exhilarating, it was also incredibly daunting. Every news outlet, every major scientific journal, and even social media outlets were abuzz with discussion about his work. Jalen's theory, which proposed a fundamental interaction between gravity and quantum fields, was shaking the foundations of long-established scientific principles. For decades, physicists had considered gravity and quantum mechanics to be two separate domains. Macro versus micro, large scale versus small scale. But Jalen's theory suggested that these two realms were connected in ways no one had ever imagined. This was not a minor deviation. This was the kind of idea that could rewrite textbooks. Some of the most respected physicists in the world were eager to take on Jalen's model. They pored over his data, analyzed the experiments, and questioned every assumption he made. There were criticisms, as expected. The theory seemed too radical, too outside the realm of what had been accepted for so long. Could gravity, this force we experience every day in such a tangible way, really have a direct impact on quantum fields, which were governed by the bizarre and counterintuitive rules of quantum mechanics? Professor Walker, the scientist who had challenged Jalen during the conference, was among the most vocal critics. A renowned physicist known for his work in gravitational theories, he dismissed Jalen's hypothesis as speculative at best. He argued that while Jalen's data was intriguing, it wasn't enough to overturn the established understanding of gravity and quantum mechanics. Walker wasn't the only one. Many in the scientific community were skeptical. But there were others who believed in Jalen's theory. Leading quantum physicist Dr. Eleanor Park, a pioneering voice in quantum field theory, came forward and publicly supported the young prodigy. She had been in the audience during Jalen's presentation and was one of the first to see the potential in his work. "What Jalen is proposing is nothing short of revolutionary," she said in an interview. "It opens up a completely new avenue for understanding the universe. We must not dismiss it lightly. Every great breakthrough in science has been met with skepticism." Her endorsement was a turning point. More and more physicists began to take Jalen's theory seriously. They requested access to his data, started running their own tests, and engaged in discussions about how to move forward with the research. The scientific world, long a place of stubborn tradition, was now a battleground of ideas. And Jalen, the 12-year-old prodigy, had sparked this intellectual firestorm. As the debate raged on, the media also turned their focus on Jalen. His young age, combined with his groundbreaking theory, made for an irresistible story. News outlets from around the world wanted interviews, profiles, and insights into the mind of this child prodigy. Jalen became a sensation. The press adored him, and public opinion about his work was divided. Some saw him as a genius on the verge of rewriting the laws of physics, while others dismissed him as an overhyped child whose ideas would ultimately fizzle out. But for Jalen, it was about the science. The media attention was a distraction, albeit a necessary one to get his work in front of the right people. He refused to let the noise sway him. What mattered were the numbers, the data, the truth. If his theory was wrong, it would eventually be disproven. If it was right, it could change everything. His team, Professor Strauss, Dr. Park, and a few other collaborators, worked relentlessly to refine the experiments and prove the validity of his claims. The next phase of testing was crucial. They needed to conduct real-world experiments in environments where gravity's effects could be tested on quantum fields. The lab in Cambridge had already shown promise, but this would require even more complex setups, more advanced equipment, and greater scrutiny. Despite the tension in the air, there was a palpable sense of excitement. In the midst of the academic battlefield, the team had an unshakable belief in Jalen's theory. They knew that if they could push the limits of their experiments, if they could uncover more data that supported Jalen's predictions, they would be able to silence the doubters for good. But there were other challenges as well. The media had painted Jalen as a boy wonder, and some of his colleagues in the scientific community were less than thrilled with the attention he was receiving. The world was still adjusting to the fact that someone so young could grasp the complexities of quantum physics in a way that many seasoned scientists couldn't. His age became a point of contention. Some couldn't accept that someone so young could contribute to a field as profound as physics. Professor Strauss, who had always supported Jalen, began to worry about the pressure that was mounting on the young scientist. "Remember, Jalen," he said during one late-night discussion in their office, "the work is what matters. The attention, the praise, the criticism, it's all just noise. The truth of your theory is in the results. Keep focused on that, and everything else will fall into place." Jalen nodded solemnly. He appreciated Strauss's words, but he also knew that the road ahead was going to be difficult. The challenge wasn't just proving his theory, it was surviving the scrutiny that came with being in the public eye. He was used to the hard work and the late nights in the lab, but this was different. The pressure to deliver, to be perfect, was overwhelming at times. Still, Jalen remained resolute. The scientific community, despite its skepticism, was beginning to take him seriously. The data they had gathered so far was compelling. The next series of experiments would push the boundaries even further, testing his hypothesis in new and unexplored ways. There was a growing sense that the tides were beginning to turn. Jalen's critics were starting to realize that there was more to his theory than they had initially thought. Professor Walker, who had been one of the loudest critics, was now cautiously admitting that the data could point to something revolutionary. He, like many others, was beginning to acknowledge that Jalen's work deserved further investigation. But there was still much to be done. Jalen and his team needed to refine their experiments, prepare for additional rounds of peer review, and face the ongoing debate in the public and scientific spheres. The pressure was immense, but Jalen had already come so far. He had broken through the walls of doubt and skepticism. Now, the only thing left to do was prove, once and for all, that gravity's role in quantum fields was the key to a new era in physics. As Jalen sat in the lab, reviewing the latest results, he couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. This was more than just a scientific breakthrough. It was a chance to shape the future. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. The pressure had never been greater. After months of theoretical work, data analysis, and public debates, Jalen was now facing the ultimate test of his groundbreaking theory, real-world validation. The scientific community was on edge, waiting to see whether his predictions would hold up when subjected to the most rigorous experiments imaginable. And Jalen, despite his young age, knew that this moment would define his future, one way or another. His team, Professor Strauss, Dr. Park, and a group of renowned physicists, had meticulously planned out the next round of experiments. They needed to test Jalen's hypothesis in an environment where both quantum fields and gravitational forces could be manipulated simultaneously. The experiments would take place at the National Superconducting Cyclotron Laboratory, one of the most advanced research facilities in the world, where cutting-edge equipment and technology could push the boundaries of scientific knowledge. Jalen had been to the lab before, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. He stood in front of the control room window, watching as the scientists prepared the equipment. The complex machinery hummed softly in the background, and the room was filled with the quiet intensity of the team's preparations. This wasn't just any experiment, it was the culmination of years of work, and it could either confirm Jalen's theory or destroy it in one fell swoop. The theory itself was simple, at least in concept. Jalen believed that gravity didn't just affect objects on a macroscopic scale, as traditional models suggested. Instead, gravity influenced quantum fields in ways that were far more profound. If Jalen was right, then understanding the interaction between gravity and quantum mechanics could unlock new realms of particle physics, dark matter exploration, and the potential for breakthroughs in spacetime theory. The implications were vast. But the question remained, could his theory withstand the most intense scrutiny science could offer? As the experiment began, Jalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The first test involved generating a high-energy particle collision in a vacuum chamber, an environment where gravity's influence would be minimized to the point of near zero. The team would observe the results, then gradually introduce varying levels of gravitational force. The key was to measure the quantum fluctuations that might occur when gravity was applied to the system. Jalen took his seat at the observation console, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed the first set of commands into the control panel. He was surrounded by experts, but in this moment, it felt like he was on his own. The data would speak for itself. If the results were consistent with his theory, if the quantum fields responded to gravity in the way his model predicted, then everything would change. But if the experiment failed, it would be a devastating blow, not just to his theory, but to his credibility. "All right, Jalen, let's do this," Professor Strauss said, his voice calm but laden with anticipation. The two exchanged a look, one of mutual respect, yet with the unspoken understanding that the outcome of this test could define everything. The experiment began with a low-energy particle collision, just enough to create a baseline reading without overwhelming the detectors. The team watched as the data began to stream in. Jalen's heart raced as he observed the fluctuations in the quantum field. The numbers were promising. The first stage of the experiment went smoothly, but they had yet to introduce gravitational forces into the system. Professor Strauss nodded, signaling for the next phase to begin. The lab team carefully activated the artificial gravity field, a controlled environment that could simulate gravitational forces far beyond what Earth's natural gravity could produce. It was a sophisticated setup, using electromagnetic fields to create varying levels of gravitational force, allowing them to test Jalen's hypothesis. Jalen's eyes flickered between the data on the screen and the experiment unfolding in front of him. The first series of measurements came in. For a moment, there was silence in the lab as everyone waited for the results to stabilize. Then, it happened. A sudden fluctuation appeared on the data monitor, a clear sign that something extraordinary was occurring. The quantum field had reacted to the gravitational force. It wasn't a small change either. The impact was immediate and profound, exactly as Jalen had predicted. Jalen couldn't help but gasp. The results were stunning. His theory was right. The quantum fluctuations were directly tied to the variations in gravity, just as his model had suggested. It was a clear and irrefutable confirmation of his hypothesis. This is incredible," Dr. Park murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. She was one of the leading experts in quantum mechanics, and seeing the data firsthand had her stunned. The lab team erupted into muted applause, but Jalen didn't feel the sense of triumph he expected. Instead, his mind was racing. There was still so much to be done. The next phase of the experiment involved amplifying the gravitational force even further to see how the quantum field would behave under extreme conditions. As the gravity levels increased, Jalen watched the data with bated breath. His heart pounded as the fluctuations grew stronger, more pronounced, confirming once again that gravity wasn't just an external force, it was an active participant in the behavior of quantum fields. For a moment, the lab was bathed in silence as everyone processed the implications of the data. The experiment was a success. Jalen's theory had been proven right, and the results were undeniable. The world of physics had just been shaken to its core. Professor Strauss broke the silence. "Well, I think it's safe to say that we have our answer. Jalen, you've done it." Jalen looked around the room, seeing the same look of awe in everyone's eyes. The data was clear. The experiment had validated everything he had proposed, and now the scientific community would have to reckon with the consequences. His theory was no longer a young prodigy's dream, it was a legitimate breakthrough in the understanding of physics. But Jalen knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge now was to convince the world. The skepticism wouldn't disappear overnight, even if the data was irrefutable. He had to prepare for the coming firestorm, the critics who would attempt to discredit him, the detractors who would try to find holes in his work, and the pressure of living up to the expectations now placed on his shoulders. As the experiment concluded and the team began reviewing the results in detail, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would be even harder than the journey that had brought him here. But he was ready. He had proven that his theory worked, and now the world would have to listen. It was time to take the next step in the scientific revolution he had started. The whirlwind of attention Jalen received after the success of the experiment was overwhelming. His once humble life in the quiet town of Cambridge was now in the past. The world, it seemed, was watching him, waiting for the next move, the next discovery, the next breakthrough. He had become an overnight sensation in the scientific community, but with this fame came a new set of challenges he hadn't anticipated. As soon as the results of the experiment were published, they quickly went viral across both scientific journals and mainstream media. News outlets from every corner of the globe wanted a piece of the story, and Jalen's name was now on the lips of every physics enthusiast. But while this newfound fame was exhilarating, it also created a pressure unlike anything Jalen had ever felt before. Jalen had never been one for the spotlight. Sure, he liked presenting his ideas and discussing theories, but the constant media presence was something else entirely. Interviews, photo shoots, and televised debates became a part of his daily routine. Every moment of his life was scrutinized, every word he said analyzed. At first, it was exciting. People treated him like a hero, like he was someone who had changed the world. Scientists from all over the world reached out to him with their congratulations, eager to collaborate or simply to discuss his groundbreaking theory. Dr. Eleanor Park, the physicist who had supported him from the beginning, arranged for Jalen to present his findings at conferences across Europe. He was even invited to deliver a keynote address at a prestigious event in Paris. But as the days went on, Jalen began to feel the weight of the expectations on his shoulders. The pressure to continue succeeding, to keep his theory intact, to keep pushing the boundaries of science, was immense. He was no longer just a curious child prodigy with a revolutionary idea, he was now a symbol of the future of physics. The world was expecting him to keep delivering, no matter how tired he was or how difficult the challenges became. Jalen also realized that, despite the success, there was still much work to be done. The media frenzy and public acclaim could only take him so far. He had to continue testing his theory, refining his experiments, and proving that what he had uncovered wasn't just a fluke. He had to demonstrate that his model was reproducible, that it could withstand the scrutiny of the most brilliant minds in the field. At the same time, Jalen began to notice the growing divide within the scientific community. While many were now rallying behind him, eager to explore the possibilities of his theory, there were still some who refused to accept it. The established scientists, the ones who had dedicated their careers to the classical understanding of physics, viewed Jalen's work as a threat. Professor Walker, who had been one of his harshest critics, was at the forefront of the opposition. He published articles in leading physics journals, arguing that Jalen's results could not be replicated and that his experiments were flawed. While young Jalen's findings are intriguing, Walker wrote in his latest paper, they are not conclusive. The theory he proposes lacks the necessary evidence to upend decades of established physics. Despite the mounting opposition, Jalen remained focused. He knew that groundbreaking work would always face resistance. Every great discovery, from Galileo's theories of the solar system to Einstein's theory of relativity, had faced skepticism. It was part of the process. If his work was truly groundbreaking, it would eventually win over even the most steadfast critics. However, Jalen wasn't naive. He understood that this battle wasn't just about proving his theory. It was also about defending his credibility in a world that wasn't ready for a 12-year-old to have such a profound impact on science. Some saw him as a prodigy, others as a novelty. The question wasn't whether he had a great idea, it was whether the world would take him seriously in the long term. The pressure became unbearable at times. Jalen found himself retreating to his study at home, where he could think without the noise of the world around him. Here, surrounded by books and notebooks filled with his calculations, he could focus on the science that had gotten him this far. He spent long nights reviewing the latest data, running simulations, and refining his experiments. The work was exhausting, but Jalen loved it. One evening, as Jalen sat in his study, Professor Strauss called him. "Jalen, I know it's a lot to handle right now. But remember, the most important thing is that you stay true to your work. People will try to distract you with the media, with opinions, with all the noise. But if you keep focusing on the science, everything else will fall into place." Jalen nodded, grateful for his mentor's words. Strauss had always been there to offer guidance, to keep him grounded when things got too overwhelming. "I know, Professor. But it's hard sometimes. It feels like everyone's watching me, waiting for me to fail. That's how you know you're onto something big. It's not easy, and it's never going to be. But if anyone can handle it, it's you." Jalen sat back in his chair, thinking about his mentor's words. The reality of his situation was undeniable. The world had changed, and so had his life. But he wasn't just doing this for the fame or the recognition. He was doing it because he believed in his theory. He believed in the potential it had to reshape the way humanity understood the universe. He wasn't about to let fear of failure stop him now. The next day, as Jalen prepared for his next public lecture in Paris, he had a new sense of resolve. His scientific journey was far from over. It wasn't just about defending his theory from critics, it was about pushing the boundaries of knowledge itself. There were still countless questions to answer, and Jalen was determined to find those answers. The lecture in Paris was a defining moment in his journey. Standing before a room full of the world's leading physicists, Jalen spoke not as a child prodigy, but as a scientist with a message to share. He spoke about his theory, about how gravity interacted with quantum fields in ways no one had thought possible. He presented new data, new findings, and new possibilities. As he concluded his lecture, the room erupted into applause. There were still skeptics in the crowd, but they were fewer now. Jalen's confidence had won them over. The evidence, the experiments, and the relentless pursuit of truth had silenced the doubters, at least for now. But Jalen knew this was just one victory in a much larger battle. The true test would come when he continued to explore the limits of his theory, when he uncovered new frontiers that no one had ever thought possible. And in that moment, as he stood in the spotlight, he realized that this was only the beginning. It had been 6 months since Jalen's groundbreaking theory had been validated in the laboratory. What began as a quiet, personal pursuit of knowledge had now blossomed into something far greater. His name was known across the globe, and his revolutionary ideas about the intersection of gravity and quantum mechanics were reshaping how the world thought about the universe. But amidst all the acclaim and accolades, Jalen had begun to notice something he hadn't fully anticipated: he had become a symbol. Not just a symbol of scientific achievement, but a symbol of possibility. A 12-year-old boy, a kid from a humble background with a mind that had dared to challenge the very foundations of physics, had inspired a new generation. Children and teenagers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, were now looking up to him, eager to follow in his footsteps. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jalen realized just how far his influence had spread. He had been invited to give a lecture at an international conference in Berlin, and while he was preparing his notes in his hotel room, he received a message on his phone that made him stop in his tracks. It was from his old school, St. Joseph's Middle School, in Cambridge. The subject line read, "A letter from your biggest fans." Jalen opened the email, and his heart skipped a beat as he read the words. The entire 7th grade class had written to him, telling him how much his achievements had inspired them. But what struck him most were the words of one student, a young girl named Clara, who wrote, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I've always loved science, but I never thought someone like me could make a difference. But now I know I can. Thank you for showing me that anything is possible." Jalen felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed in the power of science to change the world, but he had never imagined that his own story could inspire someone like Clara. It was a humbling realization, that his work was no longer just about making scientific breakthroughs. It was about opening doors for others, about giving hope to those who might never have considered a career in science, especially those who faced barriers Jalen himself had faced. As he made his way to the conference in Berlin, Jalen couldn't help but think about how far he had come. From the boy who raised his hand in Professor Strauss's lecture hall to the young physicist whose ideas were now challenging the very core of modern physics, he had surpassed all expectations. But more importantly, he had inspired so many others to believe in themselves. At the conference, Jalen was scheduled to speak before an audience of hundreds of renowned physicists and students. As he sat backstage, waiting for his turn, he overheard snippets of conversations among the attendees. They were discussing his work, debating the validity of his theory, and speculating on what he would do next. It was an awe-inspiring feeling, to hear these world-class scientists talking about his ideas with such respect. But it also added another layer of pressure. He wasn't just presenting his work anymore, he was representing an entire new generation of young scientists. When it was finally time for Jalen to take the stage, the room went silent. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, but he had learned over the past few months how to embrace that weight. He had come to understand that this moment, this opportunity, was bigger than himself. It was about the future of science, about breaking down barriers, about ensuring that anyone, regardless of their background, age, or gender, could see themselves as capable of achieving greatness. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. He could see students from all over the world, eager to hear what the prodigy had to say. But among them were the skeptics, the established scientists who had questioned his work from the beginning. Jalen knew they were waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake that would justify their doubts. But he was determined to rise above their scrutiny. "Thank you for that warm welcome," Jalen began, his voice steady but full of purpose. It's an honor to be here today, and I'd like to start by saying something that I think is really important. I'm not standing here as the smartest person in the room. I'm standing here because I believed in something that I thought could change the way we understand the universe. And I'm here because I was given the chance to pursue that belief. He paused, letting his words sink in. The truth is, all of us, every single one of us, has the potential to make an impact in this world. It doesn't matter how old you are, where you come from, or what obstacles you face. What matters is that you believe in yourself and in your ideas. Science is about curiosity. It's about asking questions and refusing to accept the world as it is until we understand it better. And if I can do it, so can you. The audience was quiet, taking in his words. Jalen could see students in the front row exchanging glances, their eyes wide with inspiration. He knew that, for some of them, this moment would mark the beginning of their own scientific journey. But, he continued, I also want to be honest with you. The road ahead isn't easy. It's full of challenges, doubts, and critics. There will be times when it feels like the whole world is telling you to give up. But the key is to keep going. Because the hardest moments often lead to the greatest discoveries. Jalen took a deep breath. I didn't come here to tell you that I have all the answers. What I came here to say is that it's up to you now. The future of science is in your hands. What will you discover? What will you prove? The possibilities are endless. The applause was thunderous, and for a moment, Jalen let himself bask in the warmth of it. He was overwhelmed, not just by the applause, but by the realization that this was his legacy. He had shown the world that a 12-year-old kid from Cambridge could do the impossible, and now, others would follow in his footsteps. After the speech, young scientists flocked to Jalen, eager to ask questions, take photos, and share their own dreams of discovery. Among them was a young boy named Malik, who reminded Jalen so much of himself at that age. With wide eyes, Malik asked, "Do you really think someone like me could change the world too?" Jalen smiled, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "I don't think you can. I know you can. Now go out there and show everyone what you're made of." As the conference ended, Jalen couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. His work had changed the course of physics, but more importantly, it had opened doors for others. The next generation of dreamers had been awakened, and it was now their turn to carry the torch. And for the first time in a long while, Jalen felt the pressure lifting. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of science, the future of knowledge, and the future of humanity. And that, he realized, was the greatest legacy he could ever leave. As the months passed, Jalen's reputation continued to grow. He had spoken at some of the most prestigious scientific conferences around the world, received accolades from famous physicists, and even been invited to consult on some high-profile research projects. His theory, once dismissed by many, had now become a cornerstone of modern scientific thought. But despite his success, Jalen felt the pressure mounting once more. The world had noticed his achievements, and with that attention came an overwhelming expectation that he would keep pushing the boundaries of physics. He wasn't just a prodigy anymore, he was a pioneer, and pioneers faced challenges unlike any other. Jalen had spent the past few months refining his experiments, tweaking his theory to account for new findings and testing its application in real-world situations. What had started as an intellectual pursuit was quickly becoming something far more tangible. Something with the potential to change the world on a fundamental level. The first major application of his theory came in the form of a joint project with the European Space Agency, ESA. The agency had long struggled with the problem of creating more efficient propulsion systems for deep space travel, and Jalen's theory offered a new way to harness the fundamental forces of the universe. In essence, if he could apply his quantum gravity model to spacecraft propulsion, it could lead to breakthroughs in speed and efficiency, revolutionizing how humanity explored space. Professor Strauss had been the one to suggest the collaboration, and while Jalen was initially hesitant, the project proved to be a perfect opportunity to test the practical implications of his work. The idea was simple. Use Jalen's model to manipulate gravitational fields in such a way that it would significantly reduce the fuel needed for space travel, allowing spacecraft to travel farther, faster, and more efficiently. But as with all great scientific endeavors, the path was far from smooth. The project quickly ran into numerous technical challenges. For one, the process of manipulating gravitational fields on a scale large enough to affect a spacecraft was far more complicated than anyone had initially anticipated. Jalen had initially thought the equations would work in practice, but now, as they attempted to run the simulations, they were faced with discrepancies that no one had expected. Jalen spent countless sleepless nights in his lab, reworking the math and running tests, trying to find the elusive solution that would turn his theoretical model into a workable reality. One night, as Jalen was buried in his calculations, his phone buzzed with a message from Professor Strauss. "Jalen, I need to see you in my office. We've got some new data from the team working on the space propulsion project. It's not good news, but we need to discuss it." Jalen's stomach sank. He had been expecting a breakthrough, not bad news. He stood up from his desk, stretched, and grabbed his jacket before heading over to Professor Strauss's office. When he arrived, Professor Strauss was waiting for him, looking more tired than usual. The older physicist gestured for Jalen to sit down across from him. "Jalen, we've hit a wall," Strauss began, his voice low. "We've run the simulations again, and the results aren't matching the theoretical predictions. Our calculations suggest that the gravitational manipulation doesn't scale as we expected. The process is unstable when we try to apply it to a spacecraft's propulsion system. In fact, it's worse than that, it's causing energy fluctuations that we can't explain." Jalen frowned. He had known that this would be difficult, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "So, what does that mean? Are we back to square one?" Strauss hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't want to give up just yet. But the application of your theory to this kind of propulsion system is proving more complex than we thought. We need to recalibrate the approach. And honestly, Jalen, this may take longer than we anticipated." Jalen ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had spent so much time and energy on this project, convinced that his theory could revolutionize space travel. But now it seemed like everything was falling apart. "I'm not sure what to do," Jalen admitted, the weight of the situation sinking in. "This was supposed to be the moment where we proved the theory works beyond just the lab. Now it feels like I've failed." Strauss looked at him with understanding. "Jalen, you haven't failed. This is part of the process. Science isn't linear. It's full of setbacks and frustrations. But every failure teaches us something. We have to keep pushing forward. You've already done something extraordinary. Now it's about finding the next step." Jalen sighed, feeling the enormity of the task before him. "But what if there's no next step? What if this is all just a dead end?" "Then we find another way," Strauss said firmly. "That's the essence of scientific discovery. It's not about succeeding right away, it's about persistence. And Jalen, I believe in your theory. I believe in what you're trying to do." For a moment, Jalen just sat there, taking in Strauss's words. He was right, of course. Science was never easy. If it were, there would be no real discoveries. The greatest minds of history had all faced obstacles, doubts, and failures. This was just another hurdle, one that Jalen would have to overcome. Over the next few weeks, Jalen threw himself into the project even harder. He re-examined his equations, adjusted his models, and began experimenting with new approaches. He worked closely with the engineers at ESA, trying to identify the exact problem and determine how they could overcome the obstacles standing in their way. The team was supportive, and they appreciated Jalen's passion and dedication. But even they were starting to feel the pressure. Time was ticking, and the project had to show results. One night, as Jalen sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of notes and scribbled equations, he had an idea. It wasn't a fully formed solution, but it was a direction. He grabbed his phone and called Professor Strauss. "I think I've got it," Jalen said, his voice filled with excitement. "I was looking at the way we're manipulating gravitational fields, and I think we need to rethink our approach. Instead of trying to directly manipulate the gravity around the spacecraft, maybe we should be focusing on manipulating the quantum fields that underlie gravity. If we can adjust the quantum field fluctuations in a controlled way, it might give us the stability we need." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "That's an interesting idea, Jalen. But you're suggesting a shift in the fundamental way we approach the problem. Are you sure it's feasible?" "I'm not sure yet," Jalen admitted, "but I think it's worth trying. I want to run some new tests with the team. We'll need to work fast, but I'm confident we can make it work." "All right," Strauss said, his voice now filled with a new sense of determination. "Let's give it a shot." For the first time in weeks, Jalen felt a renewed sense of hope. This wasn't the end of the road, this was the beginning of a new path. A path that might be even more difficult, but one that could lead to something even greater than he had originally imagined. Jalen knew that the challenges ahead would be immense, but he was no stranger to adversity. His journey so far had been filled with obstacles, and each one had made him stronger, more resilient, and more determined. This was just another test. A test that, like all the others, he was prepared to face head-on. And so, as he worked late into the night with his team, Jalen felt the excitement building inside him once again. The road ahead was uncharted, but that was where the greatest discoveries were waiting to be made. The future, he realized, was his to shape. The breakthrough Jalen had envisioned was now within reach. After weeks of sleepless nights, countless recalculations, and long discussions with the team at ESA, they had finally made progress. The new approach, manipulating quantum field fluctuations to stabilize gravitational forces, was showing promise. The early experiments, though still in their infancy, indicated that they were on the right track. But Jalen knew better than to celebrate too soon. This was just the beginning of a much larger, more complicated endeavor. The excitement in the laboratory was palpable as Jalen and the team prepared for the next phase of testing. They had already seen small successes, energy outputs that were more stable than before, propulsion systems that didn't immediately crash or burn out, and a feeling that they were on the verge of something truly groundbreaking. Jalen's confidence had been restored, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. But with that hope came something else, a sense of urgency. The clock was ticking. The ESA had set a deadline for the next round of tests, and failure wasn't an option. The world was watching. Scientists and media outlets from all corners of the globe had been closely following Jalen's progress, waiting for the next big announcement. Every day, there were news stories praising his work, but also questioning when they would see tangible results. The pressure weighed heavily on Jalen's shoulders, but he refused to let it distract him. It was on a quiet evening in the lab, with the hum of computers and the low murmur of his colleagues in the background, that the breakthrough came. Jalen was reviewing the final set of calculations for the upcoming test when one of the engineers, Lucas, called him over to the simulation screens. "Jalen, you need to see this," Lucas said, his voice tight with excitement. "We've got it." Jalen stepped over, peering at the data streaming across the screen. The figures were unlike anything he had seen before: stabilized gravitational fluctuations, matched energy outputs, and propulsion systems functioning at a level previously thought impossible. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The tests were ready. "This is it," Jalen whispered, feeling a surge of triumph. His theory was no longer just an idea. It was real. It was tangible. They were about to change the course of space exploration forever. But even as the team began preparations for the upcoming demonstration, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he reviewed the final calculations once more, a nagging sense of unease settled in his chest. The results were too perfect, too smooth. He had always been cautious about overconfidence, and the sudden success of the project made him wonder if there was something they had missed. The quantum field fluctuations they were manipulating were incredibly delicate. Any minor disturbance could lead to catastrophic failure. He pushed the thought aside. The team was excited, and they needed this victory. The world needed this victory. With a deep breath, Jalen called the team together. "We're ready," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. Let's make history." The following day, the testing chamber was filled with anticipation. Scientists and engineers stood behind thick glass walls, watching as Jalen and the ESA team prepared the spacecraft for its first trial run using their new propulsion system. The room was silent except for the occasional click of buttons and the low whir of machines coming to life. Jalen stood at the front of the chamber, overseeing the final preparations. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remained focused. This was what he had worked for, the moment that would determine the future of space exploration. When the countdown began, the room held its breath. The seconds ticked by slowly, and Jalen found himself clutching the edge of the control panel, staring at the spacecraft in front of him. This was the culmination of everything he had dreamed of, a new era in space travel. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, there was a whisper of doubt. Was this really the right move? Were they truly prepared? 10, 9. 8, the technician called out, his voice steady, but there was a nervous edge to it. Jalen could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders as he looked over at the spacecraft, his mind racing through the calculations once more. 3, 2, 1, ignition, the technician finished. With a loud hum, the spacecraft's engines fired up. The ship trembled as the gravitational manipulation system engaged. The air around Jalen seemed to crackle with energy. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then, without warning, the unexpected happened. A violent shockwave rattled the room, and a high-pitched alarm blared through the lab. The spacecraft began to shake uncontrollably, its engines sputtering in a chaotic dance of power and instability. The control panel flickered, and the once promising data turned into a flood of errors. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" Jalen screamed, his voice barely audible over the chaos. His heart dropped as he watched the engineers scramble to cut the power to the system. But it was too late. The energy fluctuations were already spiraling out of control. The spacecraft bucked and twisted as though it were caught in an invisible force. The lab was filled with the sound of clattering machinery and the frantic voices of his team. But Jalen could only watch in horror as the propulsion system overloaded, causing an explosion of energy that rippled through the lab. The lights went out. The hum of the machine ceased. The only sound in the room was the ringing in Jalen's ears. Jalen stood frozen, his heart racing as the smoke cleared and the destruction unfolded before him. The spacecraft lay in ruins. The propulsion system had failed spectacularly, and the blast had sent shockwaves through the lab, causing damage to the entire facility. It was over. The room was in disarray. Engineers were rushing to assess the damage, while others scrambled to shut down the system before any further catastrophe occurred. Jalen stood motionless, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. The data, the simulations, the equations, had all pointed to success. How had it all gone so wrong? Professor Strauss appeared beside him, his face drawn with concern. "Jalen, are you okay?" Jalen didn't respond at first. His mind was racing, replaying the events over and over again. How could this happen?" he whispered. "The theory was supposed to work. I double-checked everything." "You couldn't have known," Strauss said softly. "This is what science is about, Jalen. It's not about getting it right every time. It's about learning from failure and trying again." Jalen shook his head. "But this isn't just any failure, Professor. This is catastrophic. I know. But it's not the end, Strauss said firmly. It's just another step forward. You've already shown the world what you're capable of. This is just another obstacle, one we'll overcome together. Jalen looked around at the wreckage of the spacecraft, feeling the weight of the failure press down on him. The world had been watching, and now they would see this as a colossal failure. But Strauss was right. This wasn't the end. It was just another challenge to overcome. And Jalen wasn't about to give up. The days following the catastrophic failure were a blur. Jalen hardly slept. He paced in his apartment, staring at the equations that had once felt like a roadmap to the future. Now they mocked him. The energy fluctuations. The instability. The destruction. All of it was on his mind, replaying in a cycle of regret and confusion. The failure weighed heavily on him, more than he cared to admit. He had expected the usual post-failure grief, the questioning, the guilt, the second-guessing, but what hit him harder was the public reaction. The media had descended on the story, reporting the failed experiment with a sense of finality that made it seem as though this failure would be the last time Jalen's name would appear in the scientific community. Headlines flashed across the news: Jalen's dream of revolutionizing space travel crashes and burns, and, was Jalen's quantum gravity theory just another pipe dream? The scorn was deafening. He couldn't avoid it. Even his phone buzzed incessantly with texts and emails from colleagues, media outlets, and even people who had once been his supporters. Many of them, though polite, were questioning his theory and the direction of his work. Some even suggested that he had rushed the project, pushing forward without sufficient testing or caution. Jalen had always been ambitious, but now his ambition seemed reckless. Jalen spent days in his lab with Professor Strauss, re-examining the failed experiment. There was no denying that the outcome had been disastrous. But Jalen's mind refused to accept that the theory itself was flawed. Something else was at play. The issue wasn't the concept, it was the execution. He refused to believe that everything he had worked for was just a mirage. "Jalen, look at me," Strauss said one morning after a particularly tense analysis session. "You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You've already done something few people ever dream of. You've pushed the boundaries of what we thought was possible. But we both know this won't be the last setback." Jalen didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued to pore over the test data, staring at the numbers and trying to find an answer that would make sense of the mess they'd created. "I can't just walk away, Professor," Jalen said quietly. "I know what I'm doing. I know this theory is right." "I believe you," Strauss said, his voice calm. "But belief isn't enough in science. Sometimes, the hardest part is understanding when to change direction. When to adapt. When to see a failure not as a brick wall, but as an opportunity to find a better way forward." Jalen sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But where do we go from here? The theory was supposed to work in practice. I've tested every angle I can think of, and it all just blew up in my face. There has to be something we missed." Strauss paused for a moment before answering. "Perhaps it's not about finding another equation. Maybe it's about refining the process. Maybe we need to take a step back and reframe our understanding of how the quantum fields are interacting with the spacecraft. We've been so focused on the big picture, space propulsion, that we've neglected to focus on the smaller, finer details." Jalen's eyes narrowed as he thought about Strauss's words. He had been so focused on grand solutions, on the idea of transforming space travel, that he had overlooked the intricacies of his own model. The data suggested that the basic principles of the theory were sound, but perhaps the practical application had been too grandiose. The failure hadn't been an indictment of his ideas, but rather of how they had been applied. That evening, Jalen sat alone in the lab, staring at the equations again. The numbers were no longer a riddle to solve. They were a puzzle waiting for the right pieces. The frustration that had previously clouded his thoughts now started to clear. He knew the key to moving forward lay in revisiting the smaller details, the interactions of quantum fields, the subtle energy forces, the very forces that govern the most basic particles of existence. He pulled out his old notes from the earlier days of his research, before the pressure had begun to mount. Back then, it had been about curiosity, exploration, and discovery. There had been no race to prove himself, no looming deadlines from the media or international organizations. It had just been him and his questions. His fascination with the universe. It was time to return to that. To rediscover the essence of his work. Jalen spent the next several weeks reworking his calculations and revising his approach. He met with the engineers at ESA, proposing small but significant adjustments to their design. They were cautious, unsure of the adjustments he was suggesting, but Jalen convinced them to take the leap. It wasn't an overhaul of the entire theory, it was a refinement. A new way of manipulating the quantum fields without overloading them. A more controlled, measured approach that reduced the chances of catastrophic failure. The changes weren't easy. There were more late nights, more tests, more failure. But this time, there was something different in the air. The team was united in their determination. They weren't trying to prove a point to the world, they were trying to understand something greater. To find the truth. And then, one evening, as Jalen sat in the lab with his team, reviewing the final adjustments, something clicked. The simulations were finally stable. The adjustments were working. The spacecraft was humming with potential. "We've got it," Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of those words hung in the air. For a moment, he almost didn't believe it. Professor Strauss walked over, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Are you sure?" Jalen nodded slowly. "I think this is it." They ran the final tests on the spacecraft. The room was filled with anticipation, and Jalen's heart raced. This was the moment. The one that would either confirm everything he had believed in or prove him wrong once and for all. The countdown began. This time, there were no alarms. No unexpected failures. The spacecraft's engines fired up smoothly, and within moments, the vehicle was hovering, floating, gently off the ground. It wasn't the giant leap that Jalen had dreamed of, but it was a start. The propulsion system was stable. The manipulation of quantum fields was now within the realm of possibility. Jalen exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was no applause, no confetti falling from the ceiling, but for the first time in months, Jalen felt something real, hope. It wasn't a giant leap for mankind just yet, but it was progress. Professor Strauss clapped him on the back. "You did it, Jalen." Jalen turned to him, a faint smile on his face. "No, we did it." They had made it through the storm. Now, they were standing on the edge of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The world had written him off, but he had found a way forward. And the ripple effects of this breakthrough would be felt for years to come. But Jalen knew that the real work was just beginning. This was only the first step, and there were still more questions to answer, more problems to solve. The future was still unknown. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready for it. Jalen's phone buzzed incessantly in the days following the breakthrough. Calls, emails, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, each one marked with congratulations, questions, and invitations to speak at conferences. The world had been watching. Now that they had seen the success of the experiment, it felt as though Jalen had become the most sought-after figure in the scientific world. The media turned its spotlight on him with fervor, eager to hear the story behind the achievement that had shaken the foundation of space exploration. But with every new headline heralding his success, Jalen felt a growing sense of unease. The weight of the recognition, the relentless media coverage, it was all too much. For years, his work had been driven by passion, curiosity, and the desire to contribute to something greater than himself. Now, it felt as if his every move was being scrutinized. The expectations were rising, and they were beginning to feel suffocating. One evening, as Jalen sat at his desk in the lab, the phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. It was another media outlet, another request for an interview. He let the phone ring out, his finger hovering over the screen. He had given several interviews already. His name was everywhere. Articles, podcasts, television appearances, he was being hailed as a visionary. Yet, amid all the excitement and accolades, Jalen felt a deep sense of loneliness. The very people who had been his allies before the breakthrough now seemed distant, like figures in the background of a scene he no longer recognized. His focus had shifted. What had once been an exploration of knowledge now felt like an endless cycle of public appearances and expectations. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Professor Strauss, his face carrying the same mixture of pride and concern that Jalen had noticed in the past few weeks. "Mind if I join you?" Strauss asked, stepping into the lab without waiting for an answer. "Of course, Professor," Jalen replied, pushing a stack of papers aside to make room. "I've been working on some new simulations, but I can't seem to focus. Too many distractions." Strauss nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I can imagine. The world is watching, Jalen. It's an incredible achievement, and people are eager to hear more about what you've accomplished." Jalen sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's all moving too fast. I feel like I'm losing control. There's so much pressure, so many people wanting a piece of what I've done. You knew it would come to this. Success, particularly in your field, doesn't come without its consequences," Strauss said, his tone thoughtful. "But remember, Jalen, you don't have to shoulder all of this alone. You're not just the face of the project. You've built a team, a group of people who believe in you and in your work." Jalen looked up at him, feeling the weight of those words. The team, the colleagues who had supported him, who had been by his side through the failures, the late nights, and the challenges. He realized that in his desire to prove himself and push forward, he had distanced himself from them. The spotlight had pulled him away from the very people who had believed in his vision from the start. "I know," Jalen admitted, his voice soft. "I've been so focused on what's next that I haven't paid attention to the people who've been with me through it all." Strauss gave him a knowing look. "Success is a double-edged sword. It brings recognition, yes, but it also brings the kind of attention that can make it hard to stay grounded. Don't forget where you came from, Jalen. Don't lose sight of the people who helped you get here." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and media appearances. Jalen tried his best to engage with the press, to offer insights into the work he had done, to explain the significance of the breakthrough. But each question felt more and more like a performance, a calculated dance designed to keep the world interested without truly revealing the complexities of the project. Behind closed doors, the team at ESA was hard at work, trying to refine the system and take it to the next level. They had made great strides, but there were still hurdles to overcome. Jalen had promised them a new future, one where space travel was no longer just a dream. And now, it seemed that everyone was holding him to that promise. Late one night, after a particularly grueling round of interviews, Jalen stood in front of the large whiteboard in his office, staring at the equations that had once filled him with excitement. They now seemed like an insurmountable challenge, too big, too complex, too important. His mind buzzed with all the new pressures, corporate sponsors breathing down his neck, governments wanting to capitalize on the technology, and the ever-present eye of the media. And there was also his family. His mother had called earlier that week, her voice full of pride but also concern. She wanted him to come home, to take a break, to remember the importance of balance. Jalen hadn't taken a proper vacation in years. Every conversation with his mother now ended with her urging him to slow down, to not lose sight of the things that truly mattered in life. But Jalen couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close to changing the world. As he stood there, overwhelmed by the constant stream of pressure and expectations, Jalen felt something shift inside him. The constant need to prove himself, to silence the critics, to live up to the dreams of others, it was no longer enough. He had been so focused on the grand prize, the next big step, that he had forgotten why he had started this journey in the first place. He reached for his phone, hesitated, and then called the one person who had always understood him, Professor Strauss. "Professor, I need your advice," Jalen said when Strauss picked up. "I've lost sight of everything. It's like the weight of the world is on my shoulders." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Strauss's voice was calm and steady. "You're not alone in this, Jalen. We all feel the weight of our work. But you've always said it's about the journey, not just the destination. Don't let the pressure of expectations blind you to the bigger picture." Jalen nodded, the realization settling in like a weight lifting from his chest. He had been so focused on the endgame that he had forgotten why he had started in the first place. The desire to push humanity to new frontiers, to explore the unknown, these were the reasons he had devoted his life to science. It wasn't about fame, it wasn't about proving the world wrong, it was about something much deeper. "I needed to hear that," Jalen admitted, feeling a sense of clarity return. "Thank you, Professor. I think I've been trying to live up to other people's expectations instead of my own." "You've got it, Jalen. Just remember that the most important part of the journey is staying true to yourself and the people who have supported you along the way." Jalen smiled, feeling the pressure begin to ease. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. The world could wait. For the first time in a long while, Jalen allowed himself to focus on what really mattered. The work, the discovery, and the people who had stood by his side. The rest could follow later. The next few months passed in a blur of calculated steps and cautious optimism. Jalen had found a new rhythm. He had learned to balance the demands of fame and recognition with the quiet, focused work that had originally fueled his passion. The media had not stopped its relentless coverage, but Jalen had grown more adept at managing the distractions. His interviews were fewer and more meaningful now, as he focused on advancing his research rather than offering sound bites for the press. The team at the European Space Agency, ESA, had grown closer in the wake of the breakthrough, united by the shared goal of making history. They had refined the propulsion system, addressing the issues that had arisen from the initial tests. There were still challenges to overcome, but there was a renewed sense of determination. They were no longer chasing a dream. They were on the verge of making that dream a reality. Jalen spent countless hours in the lab with the engineers, revisiting the simulations and fine-tuning the technology. Professor Strauss had become an invaluable mentor, guiding Jalen through the complexities of the final stages of development. The work had become a collaboration in every sense, with each team member contributing their expertise and insights. The atmosphere in the lab had shifted from one of individual ambition to one of collective purpose. They were no longer just solving equations or conducting experiments, they were building something that could change the future of space exploration forever. But it wasn't just the science that had changed for Jalen. He had learned to view his work with a sense of humility that had been missing in the early days of his journey. He understood now that the path to success wasn't just about groundbreaking discoveries, it was about the people who walked that path with you. It was about the failures, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, and the resilience to push through. It was about the relationships that were forged in the crucible of challenge, and the understanding that the journey itself was just as important as the destination. Jalen's thoughts often returned to the moments when he had almost given up. The media backlash, the pressure to succeed, and the overwhelming sense that everything he had worked for was slipping away. But now, looking at the spacecraft that stood ready for its first operational mission, Jalen realized that those moments had shaped him in ways he couldn't have imagined. They had tested his character, his resolve, and his ability to stay true to his vision, even when it seemed like the world was against him. The final test was approaching, the one that would determine whether all their work had paid off. The spacecraft, now fully equipped with the quantum propulsion system, was ready to be launched on its maiden voyage. It would be the first time in history that a human-made vehicle would travel beyond the Earth's atmosphere using the quantum field manipulation technology that Jalen had pioneered. The stakes were higher than ever. On the day of the launch, the atmosphere at ESA's headquarters was electric. Scientists, engineers, and dignitaries gathered in the command center, all eyes focused on the spacecraft. Jalen stood at the forefront, his heart pounding in his chest. The pressure was immense, but there was a calmness to him now, a clarity that had eluded him in the past. He had made peace with the fact that the outcome was uncertain. No amount of preparation could guarantee success. But he had learned something invaluable over the past year. The true measure of success wasn't in the results, but in the perseverance to continue, no matter the outcome. He had already achieved something extraordinary simply by refusing to give up. Professor Strauss stood beside him, a proud smile on his face. "Ready for this, Jalen?" Jalen nodded, his voice steady. "I've never been more ready." The countdown began, and the room fell silent. Jalen's thoughts flashed to the very beginning of this journey, to the young boy from the south side of Chicago who had dreamed of space travel, who had believed that the impossible could be made possible. He had come so far, and yet, in this moment, it felt as if he were standing at the starting line of a much bigger race. The final seconds ticked away. The spacecraft sat poised on the launch pad, its quantum propulsion system humming with energy. The world held its breath, waiting to see if Jalen's vision would take flight. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. With a roar of power, the spacecraft's engines ignited. The room erupted in cheers as the vehicle lifted off the ground, rising steadily into the sky. Jalen watched in awe, his eyes fixed on the ascending craft. It wasn't just a machine flying into space, it was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and belief. It was the proof that a young boy from a humble background could change the course of human history. As the spacecraft continued its ascent, Jalen felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him to this moment. And no matter what happened next, he knew that he had done something that mattered. He had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and in doing so, he had inspired others to do the same. The spacecraft completed its trajectory, and for the first time, the world saw what Jalen had envisioned, a vehicle capable of traveling beyond the Earth's atmosphere using the power of quantum field manipulation. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Jalen, but for everyone who had believed in his dream. In the days that followed, the world celebrated. Jalen's breakthrough was hailed as the greatest achievement in space exploration since the Apollo missions. Scientists and engineers from around the globe reached out to congratulate him, eager to collaborate and build upon the foundation he had laid. The media, which had once questioned his every move, now lauded his success. But Jalen, for the first time in a long time, felt no need for validation. He had already received the greatest reward of all, the knowledge that he had created something that would last. Professor Strauss came to visit him at the lab one afternoon, just after the spacecraft had successfully completed its mission. The two men stood together, looking at the blueprints for the next phase of the project. "You've done it, Jalen," Strauss said, his voice full of pride. "You've changed the world." Jalen smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We've changed the world, Professor." And in that moment, Jalen realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, so many questions to answer, and so many new frontiers to explore. The work wasn't finished, but that was what made it exciting. The future was full of possibilities, and Jalen was more determined than ever to continue pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. As he looked out the window, watching the sun set over the horizon, Jalen knew that the journey he had started all those years ago, as a curious, ambitious young boy, was far from over. It was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?